Marion Woodman said, "Matter without spirit is a corpse. Spirit without matter is a ghost. Both describe something that is dead." One of the chaplains at Hope West this week sent me a reflection by Richard Rohr, and in his reflection he called it the sacred nature of all life. And it got me to think about the difference between the sacred and the secular. What is sacred and what is secular? Is there really a difference, or do we as human beings just have a tendency to compartmentalize everything? And even this morning, listening to the two pieces by Janet and Walter introduced them by saying one is sacred and one is secular. But can we really take the beauty of the music or the joy or the significance of what both of those pieces were and say one is more sacred than the other? Can we not find joy in both? And so that's what I've been thinking about this week, is why do we compartmentalize and what is the difference? And so Richard Rohr writes, "Almost every religion's history begins with a massive misperception, namely making a fatal distinction between the sacred and the profane. Religions often put their emphasis on creating sacred places, sacred time, and sacred actions. While I fully appreciate the need for this, it unfortunately leaves most of life unsacred. In authentic mystical moments," he writes, "any clear distinction between sacred and profane quickly falls apart. Afterward, one knows all the world is sacred because most of the time such moments happen in so-called secular settings. For example, look at the lives of Abraham and Sarah, Moses, Elijah, Mary, and Jesus. Few, if any, of their sacred moments happened in holy places, but simply wherever they were. Simply wherever they were. And so, in other words, everywhere." And I've been thinking about that this week, how we compartmentalize our lives. This is spiritual, this is not. This is religious, this is spiritual. This is secular, this is whatever. And so right now we're in the middle, we're entering our 5th class of Building Your Own Theology, and one of the members of the class, the first night, I invited everybody to share a little bit about where they came from and some of the belief systems that they were raised with. And one of the women who has been joining our class was raised in New Mexico in a Catholic family, and she really didn't even understand the question I was asking, because as she explained to us, for her as a child, there was no distinction, there was no difference in her little town in New Mexico between her Catholic faith and the culture around her. It wasn't this, that, it was just what it was. And so we spent a little bit of time with me trying to even explain the question and her just not getting it, and finally us realizing that, you know, I come from a place of secular, sacred, and what she was saying was the way that she was raised, there was no distinction. And I was thinking about that this morning, and I realized I had a different experience growing up. We would go to church on Sundays at Littleton United Methodist Church, where my parents still are members. But my mom's probably not going to want me to be happy that I say this, but she always made sure we didn't go on communion Sundays because they took so long and they were boring. And so church and the rest of life were compartmentalized for us. So Maybe it was just that her experience of Sunday morning ritual did not have much meaning for her or feel sacred to her, even though it was religious. And I think about that, when I was thinking about that this morning, it's because then she would come home on Sundays, and what she wanted to do was she wanted to sit on her back patio with a book and just look and be on the back patio looking out at her garden. And perhaps for her, that was where the sacred came in. She wasn't finding it in church on Sunday morning taking communion. She was finding it on Sunday afternoon on her back porch, sitting with her book and her garden. Is one better than the other? Is one more sacred? Is one more secular? And what does that even mean? And so this week, I have been thinking about this dynamic. What if we begin to see the sacred in the secular, in everything around us? What if we stopped compartmentalizing ourselves and our lives? And I think this may be partly why I'm so enthralled with these metaphysical classes I've been taking for the last few years. Because when we look at life through the lens of energy fields or water crystals or auras, if we begin to express our lives outside of the five senses, for me, at least, everything does become more sacred, or should I say, more spiritual. And so that's what I'm excited to explore with the kids this summer with the rice. If we begin to view the world through the lens that every little thing we do matters, every word we say, the smile that we give to somebody that's having a rough day, and if we can construe everything as sacred or holy, how might our lived expressions in our lives change? Might we add just a tad more intention to our words, our actions, and our interactions with other people? What if we were open to the possibility that every interaction we have, every single one, we have with another person or being or a little beloved animal in our home or the beloved animals on the mesa or the trees or the flowers, what if every interaction is viewed within that context of might this be a sacred interaction? And so looked at through this lens, then Father's Day today, even though it's a secular holiday, can be expressed and experienced as a sacred day, as we acknowledge the role that fathers, stepfathers, uncles, grandfathers, and all male role models play in the lives of the children in our world, in our families, in our community. There is a beautiful, sacred interaction that we can recognize and honor in the men in our lives today. As we look out, and if you are a father or a grandfather or an uncle or a mentor, we say thank you, and we honor you, and we honor the sacred role you play in this community and this society. Yesterday, UUCGV had a table at the Juneteenth celebration, supporting Black citizens and friends in their effort to celebrate, honor, and educate about Black lives. That was a secular event, but I believe it was a sacred experience as we take the time to acknowledge the hurt, the pain, the history of this country that has not felt sacred to the lives and the bodies of so many people of color. And yet there was a beautiful sacred expression in acknowledging and coming together and saying we're going to recognize, we're going to honor our history, we're going to open our arms and invite people who don't look like us to be part of this event as we realize that we are all connected. To me, that is sacred. And I arrived at the Juneteenth celebration yesterday just as they were starting to dance, and I got to be part of the dance. It was secular, and it brought tears to my eyes because it was sacred. The sacred and the secular, maybe we just call it the secular. The sacred and the secular merging, blending. Likewise, June is Pride Month, and this becomes a sacred month with a secular acknowledgement for people who historically, and in many ways today, still aren't completely safe to live the full expression of who they are, and people who have had to hide away aspects of themselves for safety. This month, in a very secular way, our culture is recognizing, valuing, and celebrating the struggles, the joys, the sorrows, the pain, the fear that people of the LGBTQ community have experienced and do experience. Once again, in my mind, that is a very sacred expression within a series of very secular activities. So where is the differentiation? Where does one end and another begin? And my thought today is that maybe it doesn't. Maybe it's just our understanding of what it means to be fully human and understanding that full humanity encompasses so much more than we allow into our lives sometimes. A few years ago, I wrote a sermon about what it means to be whole, and I was looking at my children, who were about Phoebe and Tobias's age back then, and I realized that most children don't have a concept of what it means to be whole because they simply are whole, and they don't have any other way to be. They just are. And it's like asking a fish to define the ocean that it swims in. There is no context for that fish that there is anything other than the ocean. And so I started thinking about at what point in my own life did I begin to feel separate? When did I begin to compartmentalize my life? When was it that I became more separate and compartmentalized than whole? Was it middle school? Was it high school? College? Was it earlier? I don't really know, because I think for so many of us it's just this very gradual climb, or this gradual slope that we're connected and then slowly we become more and more disconnected until maybe at some point we look around and say, I don't even recognize myself anymore and I need to get reconnected. Maybe that's just part of the spiral of life. But I do remember an experience that I've shared a few times, and I don't know if this little experience of my little 6-year-old self ever makes sense when I share this story, but it was important to me. It was, I was about 6 years old, and up till that time, I think when I talk about not understanding the difference between being compartmentalized and whole, I was just living my little 6-year-old whole life. I was just fully embodied and doing whatever you do when you're 6. And then Shannon Stark had another little 6-year-old friend, had the audacity to one day tell me that I had something called a brain. She told me that this thing called a brain controlled us and was inside our head, and we couldn't even see it. And I was devastated. And I went home and I asked my mom if I had a brain. And when my mom said yes, I remember feeling almost betrayed by her for her lack of concern. How could anybody be so nonchalant at the news that we are not us, but we are reduced to this thing in our head that is controlling us? And it was a huge crisis for my little 6-year-old self, because all of a sudden it wasn't me, I was just this thing called a brain. And so I guess I had my first existential crisis at age 6. I remember I even went into a little depression at the news, and then my 6-year-old self reintegrated, forgot that I had a brain, and went on living life. And I know that that's kind of a goofy story, but I think it's significant because it addresses something deep inside us. I don't know if as human beings we are meant to be so compartmentalized. And reflecting back on it, I think it was the sense of compartmentalization that my little 6-year-old self was rebelling against on maybe a deeper soul level. On some deeper intuitive level, my 6-year-old self knew that wholeness and maybe even consciousness meant so much more than an unwelcome part of the body that controls every move we make. And I think this compartmentalization is a very Western practice because not all cultures do this. Ann Wilson Schaaf, in her book Living in Process, writes, "Many cultures of the world have no word for spirituality. In these cultures, spirituality is in the living. It is so integrated into life that it needs no special designation. Yet many of us have lost that integration as we try to cope with our lives. Living in process is the reintegration of the spiritual into all that we do and all that we are. By segmenting ourselves and our lives, we have reduced the spiritual to a very small corner of our lives. Living in process is about the relearning of living our wholeness." I'm going to say that again. Living in process is about the relearning of living our wholeness. And her book goes on to talk about the need to reintegrate the spiritual into all aspects of our lives and let it once again become an integral part of who we are. She says that everything changed for her when she changed her paradigm. She wrote, "I continued participating in my life as fully as I could in all spheres, academics, social activities, sports, creative arts, church, and family, and trusted that I would know how to follow the path that would lead me to the places I needed to be." It's not an either or, it's a both and. We get to be very active in this world. We can be academic. We can read intellectual books. We can go to the gym. We can be physical. But we don't have to leave that other part of us behind. It's a both and. And I wonder sometimes if that's why there seems to be so much despair in our culture. And I won't say despair all over the world because I don't know that there is despair everywhere. I just know that our Western American culture has more people than we should dealing with depression or loneliness or feelings of isolation or not belonging or not feeling worthy. And I wonder if it's because we have done that very thing. We have compartmentalized every aspect of our life, and it doesn't merge, it doesn't bleed into each other. And then we get lost. If one aspect is not going right, we don't know what to do. And I mentioned, I shared that we lost Ernie Steck a few weeks ago. And a few years ago, though, he was having this conversation with me. He wanted to have this conversation, and he started the conversation by asking the question, Wendy, what can people get here, meaning UUCGV, that they couldn't just go find by attending a good lecture at CMU? And with that premise I have just laid out, and so when I answered that question a few years ago, I was like, well, wholeness and blah, blah, blah. But now, with the premise I have just laid out, I guess I would have to say, if I'm not going to contradict myself, that a lecture at CMU can be just as sacred as a sermon here. And it can be just as life-affirming as any good sermon. So I've kind of contradicted myself. So that said, then what is the difference? What would the difference be between being very engaged in, say, the League of Women Voters or activities at CMU and a faith community like UUCGV? What is the difference? And I'm throwing this question out to all of you because I don't necessarily have an answer after I have just contradicted myself. But I think my initial answer might be the opportunity when you come to a faith community like this is that perhaps this is a place where we at least attempt to create a sense of wholeness, where we attempt to see the sacred in the secular, where we can say, come here on Sunday mornings and hopefully it will feed your spirit and your soul, but come here on Wednesday nights and it will hopefully feed your body. And come and do laughter yoga on Friday mornings with Barbara Beth and let it be a sense of joy. And come here at the best times of your life when you're getting married, and come here at the hardest times of your life when you have to say goodbye. Because it's all together. We come together in wholeness when we can come with joy and we can come with grief. And we don't have to leave any one element of that behind. And sometimes we can even laugh through our tears because there can be joy in grief and there can be sadness within the happiness because life is not an either or. It's not compartmentalized. And this, I think, is what it means to be part of an authentic faith community. Like I said earlier, we definitely are not perfect, but hopefully we can be a place where you can come and be truly authentic. And perhaps this is where the sacred and the secular can blend together into one authentic whole. And with that, I invite us to sing our closing hymn, number 170, We Are a Gentle, Angry People.